Most people think they know who killed Toys R Us. Ask around, and 99% will confidently blame Amazon, but that answer is a little too neat and far too convenient. Because here's the quieter truth. Toys R Us was still earning real money right before it collapsed. It didn't fall because it forgot how to sell toys. It fell because something behind the curtain drained its strength. Three low-profile Wall Street firms, Bain, KKR, and Vornado, pulled strings most shoppers never saw. So the real question lingers. How does an $11 billion company end up empty-handed while its owners walk away untouched? Before the debt, before the headlines, before the autopsy, there was a kingdom built entirely on childhood wonder. In the 1980s and 1990s, Toys R Us was more than just a store. It was a cultural phenomenon. It was the cathedral of Christmas morning, a place where every aisle felt endless and every box seemed to glow under fluorescent skies. Parents planned entire weekends around it. Kids rehearsed their wish lists like they were prepping for Broadway, and the company itself knew its power. It was the original category killer, a retail giant that specialized so intensely it erased smaller competitors simply by existing. For 2 decades, Toys R Us operated like a freight train made of plastic dreams, heavy, loud, and impossible to slow down. It expanded across North America, Europe, and Asia, planting its signature rainbow sign in suburbs everywhere. The business model was simple: massive stores, massive inventory, massive foot traffic. Before online shopping existed, this was unbeatable. The company didn't just ride the retail wave, it created the wave. But every empire reaches a moment when the ground beneath it shifts. By the early 2000s, the landscape was changing. Big box rivals like Walmart and Target were squeezing the toy business the same way a tightening vice squeezes metal. These stores weren't better, they were broader. They sold toys, yes, but also groceries, clothes, electronics. And they used those other departments to fund aggressive price cuts. Toys R Us suddenly looked vulnerable at the edges, not because it was weak, but because its opponents were using tactics it couldn't easily copy. Still, the company wasn't in freefall. Not even close. In 2005, Toys R Us had solid cash flow, valuable real estate, and a brand every parent trusted. Its stores weren't modern, but they weren't abandoned. Its revenues weren't exploding, but they were stable. It needed innovation, a digital upgrade, better logistics, a refresh in layout. The kind of renovation every mature business eventually faces. Instead, something entirely different happened, something quieter, something with long shadows. The company became a target. To Wall Street's private equity world, Toys R Us wasn't a struggling retailer. It was a fortress filled with hidden treasure. Hundreds of owned properties, steady holiday cash surges, and a brand so iconic it practically marketed itself. To investors hunting for predictable returns, it was the perfect host. And hosts in certain financial stories attract predators. That's when Bain Capital, KKR, and Vornado stepped forward, not with innovation, but with a plan dressed like salvation. They positioned themselves as partners who would take Toys R Us private, modernize it, stabilize it, and prepare it for a stronger future. It sounded reassuring, especially to executives tired of public market pressure. But beneath the boardroom smiles, another script was already being drafted, one where the company's assets would be used against itself, one where the financial structure mattered more than the stores, one where survival depended not on selling toys, but on servicing a mountain of obligations it never asked for. And that brings us closer to the real mystery. What exactly happened inside the deal that turned a stable retail icon into a ticking financial trap? The shadows begin to take shape. Before the collapse, before the headlines of liquidations and final sales, there was a moment when Toys R Us still had control of its own destiny. But that moment ended the second a different kind of deal was placed on the table. A deal wrapped in polite language, polished presentations, and confident promises. It came with charts predicting growth, projections showing renewed strength, and a story that sounded almost heroic. But in financial mysteries, the danger often arrives disguised as a helping hand. This was the moment the private equity firms made their move. And to understand what happened next, to truly grasp the slow, invisible tightening that followed, we need to open up the mechanism inside the machine. Because the system that doomed Toys R Us wasn't complicated on paper. In fact, it was almost too simple. It was called an LBO, a leveraged buyout. But that phrase feels cold, metallic, and distant. So let's translate it into something anyone can visualize. An LBO is like buying a house using the house's own credit card. You put in a little cash up front, take out a giant loan, and then, Instead of being responsible for that loan, you hand the entire bill to the house itself. The walls, the foundation, the future repairs, they all now carry the debt, and if the structure ever cracks, it's the house that collapses, not the buyer. That's the heart of the mechanic. That's the core of the trap. Bain Capital, KKR, and Vornado collectively contributed only a fraction of the purchase price, a modest sliver compared to the mountain of debt required to buy the company. The rest? It was borrowed money, stacked high like wooden crates in a warehouse, labeled with interest rates and repayment schedules. And almost every dollar of that borrowed money was placed directly onto the shoulders of Toys R Us. The company that once built childhood joy suddenly became responsible for billions in loans it never asked for. Overnight, Toys R Us transformed from healthy to heavily burdened. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 2005, the very day the LBO closed, Toys R Us woke up carrying roughly $5 billion in new debt. Before the deal, it had manageable obligations, the kind any large retailer could handle. After the deal, it was carrying a debt load so enormous it could have knocked over a smaller company in a single quarter. And just like that, the pressure began. Debt by itself isn't inherently lethal. But the kind they pushed onto Toys R Us came with something dangerous: mandatory annual interest payments. These weren't optional, they weren't negotiable, they were fixed, relentless, and completely indifferent to how strong or weak a given holiday season might be. Roughly $400 million in interest had to be paid every single year. $400 million. Not to buy toys, not to renovate stores, not to train staff, improve websites, redesign layouts, or speed up deliveries. This wasn't money for customers. It wasn't money for innovation. It wasn't money for the business. It was money that simply evaporated. A financial drain pipe that carried cash directly out of the company and into the world of debt service. If you were working inside a store during those years, you probably never saw the debt. You saw boxes, pallets, parents, and kids. But above your head, invisible to the public, was a weight pressing down on the entire organization. Every invoice now mattered more. Every season had to be perfect. Every mistake cost double. And this is where the mechanism becomes darker, because the LBO wasn't broken. It worked exactly as designed. It just wasn't designed to help Toys R Us survive. The key insight: the LBO wasn't an investment in Toys R Us. It was an investment in Toys R Us. To the private equity firms, the company wasn't a brand. It wasn't a cultural landmark. It wasn't a childhood memory for millions of families. It was collateral, a large, predictable cash generator capable of sustaining heavy debt loads, long enough for the investors to extract fees and returns. And extract they did. The new owners charged the company management fees, a polite-sounding term for payments taken out of the business simply for the privilege of being owned. These fees added up to hundreds of millions of dollars over time, money that could have been used to modernize the website, upgrade the stores, or rebuild the supply chain. Instead, the cash was pulled upward, away from operations, away from employees, and away from the future. The company had been turned into a piggy bank with a timer. But to understand how the trap tightened further, you need to look at how the debt changed the daily decisions inside the boardroom. Imagine trying to run a marathon while carrying a sandbag strapped to your back. You might still move forward, but your steps become smaller, your breath becomes shorter, your focus shifts from winning to simply surviving each mile. And that's what happened to Toys R Us. Every strategic idea, from e-commerce expansion to store upgrades, had to pass a new test. Will this interfere with our ability to pay the debt? E-commerce investments cost money. Store remodels cost money. Logistics improvements cost money. Digital transformation costs money. And every time executives proposed these changes, the debt answered back, no. Debt doesn't compromise. It doesn't negotiate emotionally. It doesn't care about nostalgia or long-term positioning. It only cares about being paid, on time, in full, every year. And when a company must choose between investing in its future or paying interest, the future always loses. This is why stores remained outdated. This is why the website lagged behind competitors. This is why customer experience drifted downward year after year. It wasn't incompetence, it wasn't laziness, it wasn't obliviousness, it was the debt, the silent puppeteer behind every budget meeting. And this is where the mystery deepens. Because as Toys R Us struggled under this financial weight, something else was happening in the shadows, something the public rarely sees and only insiders truly understand. While the company was being drained of its flexibility, the private equity owners were steadily earning returns, not through growth, but through fees. Not through operational excellence, but through financial engineering. Toys R Us was bleeding cash to service a loan it never chose, while the people who orchestrated the deal were insulated from the consequences. The mechanism wasn't just about debt, it was about extraction. And as the years stretched on, the sandbag got heavier, the steps got smaller, and the company's ability to breathe grew weaker. The debt didn't kill Toys R Us in a single blow. It weakened it slowly, predictably, methodically, like a clock counting down to a moment. Only a few people at the top understood was inevitable, but the story isn't finished. Not yet, because the next phase reveals how that ticking clock finally reached zero, and why the collapse looked like failure, even though it followed a script written years earlier. The trap tightens. If part one was the setup, the moment the debt settled onto the company's shoulders, then what follows is the slow, methodical consequence of that weight. Because once the LBO was locked into place, the physics of the business changed. The company no longer existed to innovate or compete. It existed to service the loan. To keep the metaphor clear, Toys R Us was no longer steering its own car. It was towing a trailer so heavy that the engine strained every time the road tilted upward. And the road, year after year, kept tilting. The illusion of normalcy. From the outside, most shoppers didn't notice the shift. Aisles still stretched long. Shelves still overflowed during the holidays. Jeffrey the giraffe still smiled from cardboard cutouts. But underneath the surface, the economics were twisting. You can think of the company as a building with cracks hidden behind the wallpaper. Everything looks fine to visitors, but the people living inside can hear the structure groaning. And inside the headquarters, that groaning was constant. Every department felt the pinch. Marketing budgets shrank. Store maintenance schedules slowed. Renovations were postponed again and again. Employees inside the company described the same atmosphere: tight budgets, tight deadlines, tighter margins. Not because sales had collapsed, they hadn't, but because the debt payments demanded priority. The invisible fork in the road retailers live or die by their ability to adapt. The mid-2000s were a turning point in the entire consumer landscape. Online shopping was no longer a novelty, it was becoming the default. Amazon wasn't breathing down everyone's neck yet, but it was clearing its throat. Walmart and Target were accelerating, offering lower prices and one-stop convenience. Customer preferences were shifting fast. This was the exact moment when Toys R Us needed to pivot, modernize, and invest heavily in digital infrastructure. It needed faster delivery, smarter inventory systems, and an online store that felt alive rather than outdated. But every fork in the strategic road returned to the same central question: can we afford to pay the interest and do this at the same time? And the debt always answered first. That's the tragedy of an LBO. It shortens the time horizon of a business. Instead of optimizing for 10 years, you optimize for 12 months, because the interest is due, and missing it is not an option. The slow drain of missed opportunities. In these years, competitors invested aggressively. Amazon pumped profits into warehouses, robotics, and logistics, building a delivery machine so efficient it reshaped consumer expectations. Walmart revamped stores and expanded into online ordering. Target strengthened its supply chain and diversified its offerings. Meanwhile, Toys R Us was stuck in neutral, not by choice, by design. The company didn't lack ideas. Executives weren't blind to the digital revolution. Employees weren't resistant to change. What they lacked was oxygen. The financial breathing room needed to evolve. Debt was the ceiling. Debt was the floor. Debt was the cage. And as more time passed, the bars of that cage thickened. Why the system didn't break, until it finally did. Here's the part most people misunderstand. The LBO didn't instantly destroy Toys R Us. It didn't explode the business in a single spectacular failure. The machine kept running. Cash flows still came in. Sales still looked respectable. Holidays still delivered surges. For most of the 2010s, the company was alive, but weaker every year. Think of it like dehydration. A person can survive for a while without water, but every hour without it drains strength, clarity, and resilience. Toys R Us wasn't dying because customers vanished. It was dying because the interest payments prevented the internal repairs needed to stay competitive. Behind closed doors, executives pleaded for capital to renovate aging stores. Picture-peeling floors, dim lighting, cluttered aisles, and old fixtures. None of this was catastrophic. But in a world moving towards sleek digital experiences, these stores felt stuck in a different century, and the budget simply wasn't there. Management fees, the second drain. While the company fought to maintain its footing, another financial mechanism quietly extracted more cash upward: management fees. This is the part of private equity most consumers never see. When a PE firm buys a company, it often charges the company for overseeing it, even though the same firm designed the debt structure, causing the strain. Over the years, Bain, KKR, and Vornado collected an estimated hundreds of millions of dollars in fees from Toys R Us. These fees weren't linked to performance improvements or actual retail innovation. They were contractual, automatic, guaranteed. Imagine a lifeboat with a slow leak. Instead of patching the hole, the owners scoop out buckets of water, not to save the boat, but to sell it back to the passengers. That's what management fees looked like inside this LBO. The ticking clock no one could stop. Every LBO has a lifespan. Private equity firms rarely hold companies forever. The strategy is simple: acquire, extract, sell, or relist. The goal isn't to nurture the company. The goal is to create a financial event strong enough to pay back investors, produce gains, and move on. If the company survives, excellent. If not, that risk was built into the equation from day one. But Toys R Us had a problem. After years of underinvestment, it simply wasn't in shape to withstand even a mild downturn. The company needed a stretch of good seasons to stay stable, but retail rarely offers consistency. Then came the soft holiday season. Just one. Just slightly weaker than expected. And suddenly, the math no longer worked. The final tightening. By the mid-2010s, the debt payments consumed roughly 97% of the company's operating income. That means nearly every dollar of actual profit had already been promised before it reached the cash register. When that holiday season underperformed, the cushion vanished. The debt didn't budge. The interest didn't slow. The clock didn't pause. And with a company this large, a single-week season doesn't just strain the budget, it jeopardizes survival. Toys R Us tried to refinance, restructure, and renegotiate, but lenders had grown wary. Competitors were moving faster. Logistics had fallen behind. Stores looked tired. Online sales were lagging, and the debt demanded full repayment, not sympathy. You can almost hear the final click as the mechanism locks into place. This was not the story of a retailer killed by Amazon. This was the story of a retailer suffocated by the financial structure imposed upon it. And as we move toward the next chapter, the collapse, the truth becomes harder to ignore. Toys R Us didn't run out of customers. It ran out of time. The moment the shadows finally touched daylight. When the fall came, it didn't arrive with an explosion. It arrived quietly, the way a structure collapses after years of unseen stress. 1 week holiday season was all it took. Sales dipped, not catastrophically, but just enough to reveal how fragile the company had become under the weight of its own borrowed chains. Inside the boardroom, executives could see the math turning against them. 97% of operating income was already spoken for, swallowed by interest payments that never cared whether the aisles were full or empty. That left almost nothing for investment, nothing for upgrades, nothing for recovery. And the lenders, sensing vulnerability, tightened their terms instead of extending relief. Meanwhile, outside those boardroom walls, Amazon and Walmart kept racing forward. They weren't just competing, they were reinvesting. Every dollar of profit they earned went into faster delivery, better technology, and smarter logistics. Their engines roared louder each year. Toys R Us, in contrast, was running on fumes. It wasn't even a race anymore. It was a slow drift toward the shoulder of the highway. And the customers felt it. They didn't see debt spreadsheets or refinancing deadlines. They just walked into aging stores, dim lights, crowded aisles, dusty shelves, a sense that the magic had faded. And in retail, once the magic slips, customers don't announce their departure. They just stop coming. The effect fed on itself. Fewer shoppers meant lower sales. Lower sales meant even less money available to service the debt. And less money for debt meant lenders stepping even closer to the edge. Inside headquarters, the mood turned heavy. It became clear the company wasn't suffering from a competitive wound. It was suffering from a financial design that left no margin for error. The debt structure created by the LBO had transformed a resilient retailer into a glass tower. One tremor was all it took, By 2017, the company couldn't outrun the numbers. Bankruptcy filings described the collapse as if it were a sudden storm, but the truth was quieter and colder. Toys R Us didn't die because it sold the wrong toys. It died because the LBO made survival impossible in a single imperfect season. And that brings us to a disturbing realization, one that stretches beyond toys. If this mechanism can take down an $11 billion retailer, what else can it reach for next? The pattern didn't end with toys. What happened to Toys R Us wasn't a one-off tragedy. It was a blueprint, a repeatable system. And once you recognize the shape of that blueprint, you start seeing it everywhere. Lurking behind restaurant menus, shoe aisles, clothing racks, and even hospital room curtains. Take Red Lobster, for example. A familiar American chain with decades of history, toppled not by bad shrimp or lack of customers, but by the same quiet mechanism. A takeover loaded with debt, aggressive cost-cutting, and fees extracted by the very firms claiming to save it. Or Payless Shoes, once a staple in malls across the country, drained dry until it collapsed in waves of bankruptcies. Or Gymboree, a children's clothing brand beloved by parents, pushed into insolvency after carrying debt it didn't create. Different industries, different customer bases, same shadow on the wall, and the trend hasn't slowed. If anything, it has spread. Private equity has shifted its gaze from retail to something far more sensitive: healthcare and housing. Nursing homes, emergency clinics, and local hospitals, many have become targets. And when debt starts tightening around institutions meant to protect the public, the consequences ripple far beyond product prices or store shelves. Because the playbook remains unchanged. Buy a business, load it with debt, cut costs to keep the payments flowing, extract fees, exit before the structure gives way, a cycle engineered to repeat. And that leads to the unsettling question hovering over this moment in the story, a question that echoes the collapse of Toys R Us. If this model can dismantle beloved retailers, what happens when it reaches deeper into the systems families depend on to live, heal, and stay housed? This is where the mystery reaches your front door. When Toys R Us fell, it didn't just take a nostalgic brand with it. It took people. 33,000 workers lost their jobs almost overnight. Cashiers, stockers, supervisors, managers. Many had spent years building careers inside those stores. Yet when the doors closed, most walked away with nothing. No severance, no safety cushion, no acknowledgement of the loyalty they'd given. Meanwhile, the private equity owners who engineered the deal walked away with an estimated $470 million in management and transaction fees. Money was extracted from a company that was already struggling under the financial structure they had designed. That contrast is the heart of the problem, because this isn't just a story about a toy retailer. It's a story about the transfer of economic risk, from investors to workers, from Wall Street to Main Street. And the mechanism doesn't stay in the boardroom. It shows up in your rent, your hospital bill, your job security, your neighborhood. The strategy is quiet but powerful. Value is harvested at the top while the consequences settle at the bottom. Which leads us to the final question, the one that lingers after the dust settles. What happens to an economy when the people who create value are the ones left paying the price? Every mystery ends with a pattern. The death of Toys R Us wasn't an accident. It was a legal transfer of wealth, from workers and communities to a handful of investors who never had to face the fallout. And that's the quiet truth behind many modern collapses. Ownership matters more than logos, and financial design can shape a company's fate long before customers ever notice the cracks. So when private equity walks through the front door of any business, pay attention. Because too often when they enter, the heart of the company slips out the back, and the cycle begins again.